Hi, I'm Sleep Aid, your local sleep paralysis demon, and today we are looking at 10 more contest entries for the Webtoon Legends contest. As you may know, I made a post on the Webtoon Canvas Reddit asking for series to review and received dozens of responses. So today we'll be getting up to our 50th series review, and we still have many more left to go. As a reminder, I am reading these in order that they were posted on the Reddit post. I'm going chronologically, and so if you submitted your series and I haven't read it yet, I will be getting to it. I'll be doing every contest entry that was suggested here, as long as it met the minimum requirements of the contest. And as a reiteration, I am judging these based on their pacing and how well they capture the idea, how well they act to set up their stories, concepts, and sell themselves as entries in the contest. So I'm looking very specifically for how well we're able to understand each idea and how well it sells it to the judges. So just to keep that in mind, that I'm not judging these the way that I otherwise might be. I'm not reviewing these as a standard straight up and down review. We're looking at them as entries in the contest specifically. I also wanted to say that normally I will like each episode as we read through them. As a courtesy, I like to help bump everybody's engagement, but you might notice this time around I've already liked everything. I'm actually re-recording this because I didn't like the way it came out the first time, and so if you don't see me liking the episodes as we go, it's because I've already done that. Now then, this time we're going to be checking out Blushed, The Helper at Serenity Inn, Magic Malevolence, StickHeroes, Uphill Daisies, Joy to the World, Swan Song, Wergild, My Main Character Syndrome, and My Dream. So, let's go ahead and get started. Our first series is Blushed by Nefi Moro. It is a slice-of-life romance. The description is pretty short. It says, a cheesy story set in the 60s about two dummies who blush every time they see each other. And that essentially sums it up. Now, it is worth pointing out that as a slice-of-life entry, this falls under the most laughs category, which means that it needs 6 episodes to hit the minimum, but they only have to be 15 panels each, and so these will be shorter episodes than other categories. Firstly, I'd like to say this is a very enjoyable read. It's a fun little series with a simple concept. It's two college students that slowly fall for each other and their friend groups around them, helping to push them together and get things set up. So it takes a pretty quick approach to that idea. It doesn't really waste any time. We kind of just dive right into it. One thing that stood out to me about this is that, as it said in the description, it is set in the 60s for some reason, but it doesn't really make much use of that setting, and so the dialogue is written with modern parlance, with modern dialects, and even modern slang, and so it doesn't feel like it's quite capturing the 60s setting. And since almost everything in the story takes place at school, the characters are wearing school uniforms, so we don't really get anachronistic outfits so much, and it's not really clear why it was decided to put it in that time period. There's nothing wrong with this, it's just something that kind of struck me as a little strange, that all the dialogue is written in a very modern way. Other than that, I think that the series does a good job of very efficiently setting up the characters, setting up their personalities, and explaining things through dialogue, but it does feel like it was written by someone who probably doesn't speak English as a first language. There are occasional typos and grammatical issues, and as I often recommend, I would suggest getting someone to proofread that just to check it over and make sure that the dialogue is all grammatically correct so that the readers are not confused by any of it, and it's always clear what the characters are meant to be saying, because there are a few small issues with grammar in this. although they are largely non-invasive, but it's just something to keep in mind. Otherwise, I did enjoy this. I think I said it's a cute story. It's fun to read, and again, it's relatively short and to the point about setting up our characters, building up their reputations and personalities, and showing how they become attracted to each other and how they slowly begin to work toward talking to each other, and we're essentially setting up the beginnings of their relationship. So it's a simple concept that gets right to the point and doesn't really leave much to speculate on. It doesn't really leave a lot in the way of tension. My only concern with it is that since it is under the slice of life genre, it's considered most laughs category, and I think that the way that slice of life is categorized alongside comedy under most laughs means that even for a slice of life series, the judges are really going to be expecting that it has an amount of humor in it, and this one does do a good job of having humor interspersed, but it's clear that the romance is the main focus, and so perhaps structuring a couple of stronger jokes into it might help, but I do think it does a good job of having an amount of humor sprinkled into it. And so yeah, it's just a very fun and enjoyable light read. I definitely recommend checking it out. And I think it does a quite good job of setting itself up and establishing what the point is. The only other thing that I could perhaps say about it critically is just that with the contest being structured the way it is, I tend to assume that Webtoon is looking for story ideas that will work as ongoing series. Even the winners of the contest, it's stated that they'll go on to become original stories, and so this is the type of story that it is really written more as a one-off. It sets up two characters that are trying to build a relationship with each other, that are trying to get into a relationship, and usually with a romance story of that nature, the story kind of ends when they get together, and it runs out of steam when the characters actually start that relationship. And so this one seems like it might have a clear-cut end point, whereas I'm not sure how it might continue past that, but there are enough characters and there is enough intrigue to where they could perhaps stretch it if they wanted to. But that's just one thing that stood out to me, is that it seems like a short one-off story that probably does have a pretty close end game. But yes, very, very enjoyable read, and I look forward to reading more of it. So good job on that. Next, we'll be taking a look at The Helper at Serenity Inn by V. Nelson. This is another slice of life, but it is also a fantasy, so let's read the description and then we'll get into it. So, after losing his last job, Silver decides to take his chances with an odd offer from a popular inn. All it says is that they need a helper, but they offer room and board, along with pay, so surely the job can't be that bad, right? Now, this also being a slice of life, it is about exactly what the description says it's about. It's about a young man getting a job at an inn and getting familiarized with that job. So it's a little bit light on plot because it's a slice of life series. It's kind of just about the daily lives of characters living in a not mundane setting, but kind of a mundane way. And with this one, the way the comic is structured, essentially, we introduce our main character right away. He comes into the job right away, and then we spend the remainder of the episodes one by one introducing the patrons of the inn. And so we go door to door, room to room, one episode at a time, talking to one patron in each episode and just kind of introducing the oddities that each of them has and kind of setting up the way that the staff will have to interact with them in the future. It's a little bit formulaic in that sense, that because we're explicitly going room by room, one episode at a time, we always know that each episode is going to be focused on a different character, a different patron of the inn, which doesn't really build as much of a natural opportunity for the characters to be introduced, because we are quite literally seeing introductions to them. We're introducing our main character as a staff member to the customers one at a time, and so I think that perhaps another way to go about this might be to have some kind of scenario that shows how the characters interact with each other, because as it stands, we only ever see our main characters, the staff members, interact with each patrons, but we don't see the patrons interacting with each other, and so we don't see how their personalities might play off of each other, and the types of ways that their interesting fantasy predicaments and traits might kind of play off of each other. And so that's something that I think we could do a little bit better perhaps here, show what an average day is like for someone working at this inn. Also, just a small oddity, a little aside, is that because it's built as an inn, we're introduced to the establishment as an inn. I usually would expect that an inn in a fantasy setting is kind of like a hotel. It's kind of like a way station. It's somewhere that travelers pass through and spend a little bit of time at, but don't live full time at, whereas in this case, the building that we're introduced to is more like a boarding house. People have permanent rooms here. They stay here long term, which is not really what I thought we were going to be getting. I figured it would be more like our characters working at a tavern/hotel and just interacting with passers-by who were traveling through on fantasy adventures, but instead we have characters that kind of just live here permanently, and so it's more like an apartment than it is like a hotel. And yeah, just a fun, quick, little charming story, but again, it kind of falls into that pitfall of being in slice of life, which is under the most laughs category, which tells me that the editors, the judges, might be looking for something with a little bit more focus on comedy. And whereas the way that this story is structured, because we're introducing a new character in each episode, we're building the opportunity to have easy and obvious setup and payoff jokes in those episodes, and I feel like we don't take those opportunities often enough, and so maybe a little bit more of a humor focus would have helped it be more competitive in the most laughs category. As it is, I don't know how well it will do. I'm not really sure what the judges are looking for exactly in that category, but again, because it's called most laughs, it kind of sets the expectation that humor is going to be a focus of everything that's in it. So that's just something to keep in mind, but otherwise we have a pretty simple concept here, and as with most slice of life media, it's very easy, light reading. It's low stakes, it's low impact, and it's just kind of a fun little ride with relatively entertaining characters interacting with each other in silly and relatable ways, and so I think it does all of that rather well. I'll look forward to seeing where it goes and how it might develop. It would be nice, again, with all these characters we've introduced, to see how they interact with each other and what relationships they might have with each other, considering that they all are long-term residents at this establishment. So, good job. Keep it up. Okay, next we have Magic Malevolence by Silver Crystal Art. This is a thriller. The description reads, after getting their footing in a post-apocalyptic world, Azari and her friend, child Zaleen, work on finding an explanation for these parasites and a way to help civilization to return, but coming hardships might make them lose sight of their goal. So, this is a post-apocalyptic series about a strange parasite that was discovered in the world, and by connecting with it, people were able to gain magic powers. They were given supernatural abilities, but this created a time of peace in the world. However, after 2 years, the parasites fully took over their host and turned them all into plant monsters, and so now those who did not connect with the parasites are left to survive in this post-apocalyptic world that has been taken over by essentially plant zombies. And that is our entire premise, and our characters are trying to find some way to cure this, but before we get to work toward that cure, the characters accidentally destroy the remnants of their food supply, and so they have to go out and get more, where they encounter a plant parasite, where one of the characters becomes injured, and since the plants are in fact poisonous, we then have to take another aside to look for the materials to make a cure to save her from dying. And so there's kind of a lot going on with this, but it's a little bit fast and loose with the details. And so with an apocalyptic story like this, usually when you introduce the world and the setting, you want to make sure that you're establishing what the actual threat is. So we know that we have these plant parasites that are killing anybody that's not a plant. They're going to attack and poison you, and you'll either die or turn into one of them. But the threat is not very clearly defined, and so it's important whenever you have an imposing threat like this, an apocalyptic threat like this, and this survival scenario, it's important to make sure that the readers are able to understand what the creatures are capable of, what the rule set is around them, how do our characters have to interact with them, and what types of strengths and weaknesses do they have. That way we can fully understand the actions that our characters take and kind of get a feel for what the characters should be doing, and that helps to build that tension if we know the rules of the plant monsters. So we don't really get a lot of information on that, and it would be nice to know a little bit more about it. One of the staples of post-apocalyptic media and swarm media like this, like media where there's a zombie threat or a plague threat or an overwhelming threat of just massive odds that's infecting a population. You want to, again, just really lay out the details of that, because people like to be able to self-insert into these situations and imagine what they would be doing and how they would approach it, and whether or not, again, the characters are doing something that makes sense, or if there's maybe another way, and so that we can just understand the actions that our characters are taking a little better. It's important to understand the threat that they're faced with and what the rules are that they have to contend with, and so taking a little bit more time to set that up would help the reader get more immersed in the world. Something that this series actually does pretty well is it keeps the pace moving and it keeps the tension going, and so as a thriller, it is understanding that it needs to be thrilling and that there needs to be a constant pressing threat. And so even though we don't really understand the parasite threat that well, we do know that it is a threat, and we do see that it does cause problems for our characters and how they have to work to try and overcome those problems. And so we keep a constant momentum with it, and I think that's pretty good. I mean, it's important, again, with a thriller, to make sure that there is something thrilling happening that kind of keeps us moving into the next episode, and we do a pretty good job of that here by setting up these scenarios where our characters are constantly finding dangerous situations and there's constantly a threat, and that kind of drives us forward. So it does have a decent understanding of the type of pacing that's expected of this genre. It just maybe could go into a little bit more detail with some of these scenarios and take a little bit more time to build out these situations. And also build up some of these characters, because we learn that most of our characters do have history together, but we only know a little bit about it, and it doesn't feel like we really know our characters all that well, and so it's harder to kind of get invested in that. But overall, I think that at times the pacing is almost a little too fast, but it's good that things are constantly happening and that there's a constant threat being placed upon the characters, because, again, in a story like this, that's important. You want to make sure that you're not getting too bogged down in the details to where we're just sitting around doing nothing. We want to make sure that there are events pushing the plot forward, and so this does keep a steady pace. I think that it sets a decent enough idea. It's a simple enough idea. A parasitic threat in a post-apocalyptic world with a survival scenario and attempts at finding a cure. It's a pretty common premise, but that's a decent setup. There's a reason it's common. It's because it can be very effective. I do think that this comic doesn't quite execute all of that to the fullest, but I think it has some good ideas and at least a reasonably good understanding of what is expected from this type of story. So good job with that. I'll be curious to see where it goes. Okay, next we have StickHeroes by K. Rosart. It is a fantasy action, and the description reads, when an ancient relic of drawings is grasped into the wrong hands, it's all hands on deck for every single hero, all except for the quiet shepherd Thalia. She faces her own problems, however, when a looming threat harms the village. So, this is an interesting premise, but it's a little bit hard to tell what exactly it's about. It seems to set some things up pretty well, but it's not entirely clear what is going on here. So before we dive into it, let me just get back to the part in the description. When an ancient relic of drawing is grasped in the wrong hands, it's all hands on deck for every single hero. So this appears to happen in the comic, but what's important in this case is establishing what is the ancient relic, what does it do, what is it capable of, and why do we need to be worried about it being in the wrong hands. And there are elements in the comic where we can kind of speculate on that, but it's not really clear what the actual threat is, what the actual journey is that our characters need to go on, what they're actually trying to save the world from. And so with a simple fantasy adventure story about fighting bad guys and saving the world, it's kind of important to know who the bad guys are, what they're capable of, and as well who our heroes are and what they're capable of. And we need to set those stakes up right away, that way we can get invested in them, whereas I feel that this one kind of glosses over that and doesn't really do enough to labor that setup so that we can kind of understand what type of world we're getting involved in. It does do a decent job of setting up our main character Thalia, and it does do a good job of keeping the pace high. So as a fantasy story, it's going to be in the most epic category, and we do have epic things going on. After our hero leaves the village, we know that it's going to be a little bit less defended, and so all of a sudden some kids playing in the woods accidentally get the attention of a monster, which then attacks the village. And so we've got just the remnants, the people that are left behind, the villagers trying to defend themselves from a threat that they're not really prepared for and that they don't entirely understand. And as this is going on, we have our shepherd girl character attempting to stand against the monster, to stall it, to try and prevent it from hurting anybody. But as she has this altercation with it, she notices something strange about it, something in its eyes, to where maybe it's not actually the monster that they think it is. Maybe there's something else going on here. But before we can extrapolate on that, it's shot by a catapult, seemingly dies, and we don't really get any information on it. One thing you might notice is that it appears to be one of the drawings from the book in the intro scene, but again, since we don't really know the details on what the book is, what it's capable of doing, we don't really know much more than that, and we can only speculate on that. And so then we end up ending our comic, and I will say it does a good job of building this action sequence. It's pretty well delivered. We set the scene up pretty well. There's a good sense of motion. There's a very easy to understand situation, and sometimes with action sequences like this, it can be easy to maybe zoom in too much or not zoom out enough, or focus too much on smaller actions and make it harder to understand the larger scope of things. But this comic does a good job of demonstrating that, and so I think it is well done, and it shows that there is certainly a lot of potential with this series and its fun little stick people and their wacky misadventures. But I think it's just important that, again, as a fantasy story foremost, we need to make sure that we know what are the forces at play here, who are the antagonists, who are the protagonists, and how do their ideals clash, and what abilities do they have that are going to clash, what are these ancient relics that we're dealing with. And then we end on the cliffhanger of what seems to be our hero presumably being executed. He appears to be getting executed here. We don't know. We don't see the moment of his death, but we cut right before it happens, and so that's a pretty suspenseful cliffhanger for our next bit it only falls a little bit short because, again, we don't know who these antagonists are or why they're doing what they're doing, and they're hinting that maybe the character's understanding of what's going on isn't complete. Maybe there's something else at play here with the king who has gone mad, but because we, the reader, already don't really understand that very well, it's not really effective to imply that it isn't what we thought it was when we don't really know what we were supposed to think it was in the first place. And so just a little bit better setup, a little bit more detail on the conflict in this world and the stakes of it all would be very helpful, I think, toward this story. So I think it shows us a lot of good stuff. It shows us a lot of potential, but just a bit more time spent setting up the narrative would help us get invested in it more. However, I will be very curious to see where it goes next, so good job on that. Okay. Next we will be looking at Uphill Daisies by Maren Corey. It is a crime mystery thriller. The description reads, "Who will be pushing up the daisies next?" The guests looked at each other in horror at the discovery of a mutilated body in a locked room. They had spent only one night at the manor, waiting for the inviter to show up, only to find out they had been trapped with no escape. So, as demonstrated in the description, this is a murder mystery series where a large group of people have been invited to a mansion and locked inside, and no one is able to leave, and one by one, they begin to die mysteriously. And the implication is that they're being killed by the ghost of the former owner of the house. Whereas, obviously, most of our characters not believing in ghosts think that someone is orchestrating all of this, and for some reason. So, it is a classic caper, it's a classic mystery concept of, again, just a bunch of characters locked in a building together, and as they start dying, we need to try and figure out what's going on so that our living characters can hopefully escape it. As simple as that concept is, this story is very, very difficult to understand, and so it is setting up a crime and murder mystery, but it goes about it in a way that makes it really hard to follow. And so in a story like this, where we have a specific amount of characters, all with specific backgrounds locked in a house together, it's important that we really get a good introduction to all of those characters so that we know who everybody is, what each of their unique individual talents and backgrounds might be, and that kind of builds the expectation of how they might interact with each other, and it also helps us, the audience, speculate on who might be involved with the crime and who's not, who might be hiding something and who's not. But we don't really get a very detailed introduction to any of the cast, and since a lot of them have similar outfits and hair colors, it can be kind of hard to tell them apart at times. And so the way that this story is told is kind of non-linear. It jumps around a lot between present and past and flashback and speculation, and so we're constantly shifting scenes. And again, since we don't have a very good understanding of who the characters are, it's easy to get lost quickly because we don't really know these people that well, and so when we cut to a scene that has a few of them specifically involved, it isn't always clear right away who exactly those people are, and it's hard to keep track of all of the details. It's hard to keep track of the characters, and so we need to make sure that we really spend a lot of time setting their personalities up, even if we're just kind of doing a quick and dry job of it, just with, you know, simple introduction plates. But we need to make sure that we know who they all are and kind of create a sort of uniqueness in them so that they stand out, so that they're instantly memorable. That way, when we have these scenarios where people are suspecting each other of murder, we're able to immediately identify who's involved. We also have this issue, like I said a moment ago, about the story constantly jumping in the timeline, and so we are shifting between the present and flashbacks. We're shifting between characters' retelling of events, and different perspectives of those events being retold. And so, since we're constantly jumping around like that, it's easy to get lost. It's very hard to put things into sequence because they're not given to us in sequence. And so, again, with a mystery of this nature, it's kind of important to keep things in as linear a timeline as possible so that the audience can follow along with everything that's happening and they know very clearly what the order of events is. Whereas the way that this story is told to us, it's easy to lose track of the order of events. It's easy to lose track of the timeline, and the timeline, obviously, for a murder mystery is very important. Something that good mystery writing will usually do is introduce as many of the important details as possible, even if they're just in the background, but it'll kind of brush over and set up everything that we need to know as readers to solve the mystery. And so everything that our characters know, the readers ideally should know as well at the same time, or at least should have the opportunity to observe so that we can follow along and try to piece the mystery together, try to put together the puzzle as the characters are putting it together. We want the reader to be able to figure out the mystery at a similar time to the characters being able to figure it out so that we can be engaged with it, so that we kind of have an idea of what to look out for. And we don't really get that with this, so there are a lot of details that aren't really set up, and there are pieces of information that are kept from us. So there are things that the characters know that we don't know, and so when those get revealed, it doesn't really feel like it's paying off a prior setup. It kind of just feels like something is being sprung on us that we couldn't possibly have known. And so we have theories being put forth by the character that we couldn't possibly have come up with on our own because we don't have the same information that they have. And so there are a lot of things that could be done to improve the investment that the audience has in this mystery to make it more gripping and more thrilling. And so that's the type of thing that I think we could probably put more of a focus on here. Another thing that shifts a lot is the tone. It's kind of hard to understand what the tone is meant to be because our main character is a kind of bumbling detective, and we have these constant comedy asides. And so while there's a murder mystery going on, while our characters are trapped in a house where they're being killed one by one, and so we have a very dire life and death situation full of conspiracy and intrigue, we're getting all these weird cutaway jokes that are constantly undercutting that thrilling tone, and so it feels very tonally inconsistent. I'm not sure how seriously I'm meant to take things. And so, yeah, there's a lot about this that I think could be done differently that would help to improve it, that would help people to get more invested in it. It is vaguely interesting, though. I think I am curious to know what the solution to all of this will be. It's just a little bit hard to keep track of. So it might be nice in a story like this where we're jumping around, where we don't have a clear timeline given to us in the narrative. It might be nice to add some type of framing device, whether it be like a detective's journal or a detective's log, something in the story that puts things in sequence so that we, the readers, can keep up with what the characters are keeping track of. Maybe building some kind of notebook or some kind of logbook, something to kind of help tangle or detangle rather the information and make sure that it's clear to the reader at all times what has actually transpired, what has been discovered, and what details that we have to think about and speculate on. So I do think, though, that we do a decent job with the visuals. I like that there's a lot of different cuts, a lot of camera angles. They make good use of the environments, and so there's also a constant driving to the pacing. I did criticize the pacing, namely the stories constantly flip-flopping between timelines, jumping forward and backward into flashbacks and whatnot, but it does feel like things are constantly happening in this. It is driving forward, and it is attempting to create more intrigue, and so it's good that we're not getting too bogged down in the details, even though with a story like this I do think that we need more detail. But there is definitely something here. There is potential in this narrative, and again, I'm curious to see where it will go. Okay, next we have Joy to the World by Cartoon Nickname. It is a fantasy action series. The description reads, after being transported to a land full of death and decay, Max, a young man whose bits get old fast, sets out to make everyone in the world laugh, even if most of that world wants to kill him. This is, an interesting story. It is an isekai story, and I'm not really sure what to make of it, so let's go ahead and dive into it. I'll talk about it a little bit, but... So we spend our first episode on prologue setting up the base premise of the world, which is a fantasy world full of war, death, famine, disease, all kinds of human problems, until one day a mysterious man in red shows up, destroys everything, offsets the balance of the entire world, and leaves it in a post-apocalyptic state, only to then disappear. And so now the remnants of humanity are struggling. There aren't enough resources to go around, there's not enough food, and there are horrific monsters that are roaming the land, and so living in this place is very difficult. It's quite dire, and the world is essentially praying for a hero to come and save them. They want someone to set it right so that everybody can live a decent life. And that's our base premise. That's our introduction to the world. And in our second episode, we have our main character being isekai'd into that world. He shows up here upon his own death and is sent to this world to seemingly save it. Please save this dying world. That's our that's our inciting incident, as our character being sent here. But we then jump some days later, and our isekai protagonist in this dying world that is struggling with starvation and monsters and danger. Our isekai protagonist is wandering around with a wacky instrument getup, essentially doing a comedy routine in the town square, and immediately our tone is kind of strange. So typically with an isekai, we want to set up right away what our character is trying to do, what is our main goal, and what abilities does our character have that uniquely qualifies them for this goal. Why is our character the one that's been chosen to be sent into this fantasy land? What does he have about him? What special traits make him qualified to come to this world and potentially save it? And we don't really learn much about our protagonist at all. We just kind of get introduced to him being kind of silly, and as the description said, his goal is to make everyone in the world laugh, but as the comic says, his intention is he's meant to be saving the world, but he doesn't really address that much. So how does he feel about saving the world? Does he care about that? Would he rather just do comedy in the town square? We don't really know. It's not really clear why he's doing the things that he's doing, and it's not really clear what the purpose of this narrative is. And so we don't know enough about our protagonist to really get invested in him and to really get invested in the journey that he is apparently meant to take. And so it feels like there's some important setup that is missing here, and it's kind of hard to tell what type of story this is going to be. Anyways, after our song and dance routine, the city is attacked by a monster, and the monster is then subsequently killed by a powerful monster hunter, who is this lady with a scythe, and she's very intense, very serious, very irritable, not approachable at all, and our main character kind of latches onto her and annoys her to the point of tricking her to kind of go on an adventure with him. And so we've got kind of the setup. We're starting to get the ball rolling and on making the narrative move. It just feels like our characters kind of lack intentionality. It's not really clear like how the things that they're doing are serving their broader goals. It's not really clear what those broader goals even are. And so in terms of how our character is meant to save the world, we don't really get a good idea of how his actions are serving that end. We don't really see how this quest is being set up, or even what he needs to do in order to save the world. We don't even know what his overall quest will end up being. It's just, it feels like we've missed a couple of steps in setting this whole thing up. And so while it does have some fun interactions between the characters, and I am curious to see how their journey will play out, how their relationship will develop, and kind of what types of scenarios they might get into, it just feels like we don't really know enough about what the point of it all is. I think that some of the setup is missing. So there's potential in this series for sure, but it needs to kind of circle back a little bit and establish what this is all about. Nevertheless, good job, and I shall look forward to seeing where it does eventually go. Okay, next we have Swan Song by Bifrost Creatives. This is a supernatural fantasy. The description reads, when you're raised by Mother Earth herself, your life's bound to be strange. Despite it all, Dorian tries to be normal. However, seeing omens of when people will die doesn't help things. When he and Ellie move to a new town for a fresh start, the calm doesn't last. Disaster is brewing in the forgotten corners of the world, and Lord Death Eternal has begun to stir. So that does more or less sum up what we get out of the 4 episodes that we have here. Unfortunately, it is a little bit vague, and it isn't really clear what type of story this is meant to be, so we spend a lot of time in this showing how our main character gets enrolled in school and goes to school and gets introduced to everybody. But if we start here with our first episode, we have our 2 main characters assuming new aliases as they're moving to a new town. And our main character takes the name Dorian. We know that he has the ability to see when living things are close to death, and so we do a good job of setting this up naturally in the world by showing, as he's walking to school on his first day, a snail that's in the sidewalk, the path of the sidewalk, has a halo appear above its head, and then he moves it, the halo disappears. We have, in that same scene, there's a squirrel that's jumping into the road. It has a black halo. It gets hit by a car and dies. And so we've kind of set up the parameters. We've set up the rules here of how this ability works, how this seeing of death works. And that is all very good. That's good setup. But we then go on to not really make any use of that for the remainder of our introduction. And so all we really know about our main character is that he is connected to death, and he has the ability to see visually when things are close to death, but apparently he's just trying to live a normal life. We don't really know what his goals and motivation are, and so why we should be rooting for him as a main character. It seems that he doesn't really have any grandiose overarching plans or objectives. He's just trying to live. And so we even have this whole conversation between our 2 characters where our guardian, Mother Gaia, or Mother Nature, tells him, hey, you've been enrolled in school, and he's annoyed about being enrolled in school. He's annoyed about having to go to school, and she says, well, I think you're happier when you're around other people, because otherwise you'll just sit around and play video games all day. So we don't have a very motivated protagonist, and we don't really have an immediate journey to kind of get invested in. And so it's important in this case to establish how the story is going to rope him into it, how he's going to get dragged into some kind of interesting plot or adventure, because if his primary goal is just to live a normal life, we need to make clear very quickly that if this is going to be an interesting story that's not a slice of life story, we need to make clear very quickly why his normal life is being threatened, why he's not able to easily just kind of blend in and live a mundane life. And we don't really do a lot of setting that up. So we spend a lot of time again on his as his first day of school, where he's being introduced to everything, he's being toured around and making new friends. But we don't really reprise that death sight ability, and that would have been a perfect opportunity to do so. So in a scenario like this, you have a character that can see people that are close to death, and you send that person to school, and we kind of need to set up why he struggles to be around other people, why he struggles to live an ordinary life. And if he could see that there were people in the school that were closer to death, then that would create that dissonance, that would create that difficulty in making connections. But we don't really reprise it. And so as soon as he gets to school, he goes through a mundane day at school, and so nothing particularly interesting happens at the school. We introduce, obviously, what are going to be some of his friends and whatnot, and so we're doing work building the characters and building those connections, but we don't really build a connection to the broader plot of the story. And so it is important to get our base characters set up, get our base relationships set up, but I do think that we could spend a little bit more time connecting this to whatever the overarching narrative is. And so there is the B plot going on in the background, which is our guardian character, Mother Nature, taking on her natural deity form and going into this alternate world that exists and asking for information. And that's where she learns how the avatar of death has come back, and he's killing the 7 deadly sins, and somehow this is going to relate back to our character Dorian, but we don't really know how yet. And so it feels like a lot of thought has been put into this story, and I feel like there's probably a deep and interesting and engaging narrative here. But I think that as a pitch in the Webtoon contest, we need to get some of those elements explained a little bit sooner. We need to kind of get to some of those points a little bit faster, because if you're reading this as an editor or as a contest judge, by the time you're done reading these episodes for the entry, you still don't really know what the story is about. You still, we've got a lot of the base elements. We've been introduced to a handful of different traits that this world has, and a couple of the rules, but we don't really know what type of narrative this is going to be. And so it's very important with this contest, or with any contest really, to try and set that stuff up really quickly. We need to know what is the stakes of it all. How is this all going to tie back to Dorian, and what type of adventure is he going to get dragged into? What type of story is he going to get connected to? And again, how is this supernatural world that's going on in the background, how is that going to forcibly involve Dorian? And so I think that setting this up, building hints toward this, is good, because it tells us that obviously there is something there is some intentionality there is a direction this plot's going to go. I think we just kind of don't get there quite fast enough. So it's important with a larger narrative like this to build that intrigue, and this does a good job of hinting at things that are intriguing, but it doesn't give us quite enough to where we can really understand it well enough to truly latch onto it. And so obviously, you can't give away the whole plot right away. You need to keep some things mysterious so that you can have interesting reveals in that slow development, but we need to make sure that we're giving enough to where people kind of know what they're getting themselves into. And I think that this falls just a little bit short of that. So it would be nice to have just a little bit more of a clear-cut connection between these supernatural worlds, and as I said earlier, to kind of explain how all of this is going to forcibly involve Dorian, how this is going to haunt him and prevent him from living the ordinary life that he seems to want. And so I do think it does a lot of things well. I think I've been focusing kind of more on the critique that I have, but the character designs for this are very interesting, and it's clear that, as I said, the characters have a lot of thought behind them, and a lot of planning went into this. It's just that the early pacing here just needs to be a little bit faster to kind of give us a quicker look at where it's going to go. And so there's a lot of potential with this story, and I am very curious to find out more about it. We need a little bit more, a little bit faster. So especially I will say, as something in the supernatural category, that means it's under most gripping, and so most gripping means it's going to be competing with horror stories, it's competing with thrillers, it's competing with murder mysteries, and so when we spend so much of our time kind of building up the more mundane element, the slice of life aspect, we want to make sure that we're creating something gripping, and so that's where I say that we kind of got to get that death angle in there sooner. We got to get that intrusion into Dorian's life and kind of show why he's struggling to maintain normalcy. So again, I feel like it probably sounds like I'm being hard on this one, but I do think it actually is very good. It does a lot of things right. It looks very, very nice, and there's a really interesting world here. So very good job on this, and I will look forward to reading more of it. And yeah, I think we did subscribe to this one. So. Okay, next up we've got Wergild by Wergild Comics. It is a fantasy supernatural. I'll go ahead and read the description and then we'll get into it. So it says, when an ancient plague resurfaces in Cairo, Egypt, a medical student with mysterious abilities, along with her bitter bodyguard, searches for a cure to protect her city and the ones she loves. That description does kind of describe what's happening here, but when I started reading this, I was immediately overwhelmed with information and very confused, and what I didn't realize was this here. I scrolled past this the first time without noticing it, but if we see this, it says episode 33. So this is actually taken from an ongoing series on Canvas, which has shorter episodes that have been stitched together to make up the lengthy episodes that we're using as contest entries. And so we're starting 33 episodes into this story, meaning we don't really get good introductions to any of our main characters or what it is they're supposed to be doing. There's some amount of that we can kind of pick up on as it is just kind of in context. We can pick up context clues and kind of figure out a little bit what's going on here, but there's a lot of setup, there's a lot of introductory work that would have happened earlier in the comic that we don't get, and so being thrown into it at episode 33 is extremely confusing, and there's so many elements that are just kind of talked about and thrown around, and things that seem to be paying off earlier setups that we aren't privy to. And so if you're starting here, if this is the first time you're ever reading this comic, it's really hard to follow what's going on. And so this for me was extremely confusing. I haven't read the Canvas version, so this was my entry point into the series. And while I think starting at a later point in the series for the contest entry can kind of help to get to the good parts, so to say, I think that what we really need here is setup. We're lacking in all of the setup, all of the context, and so it's just too hard to understand it without having those introductions. And I think that probably a better way to go about doing this, to take a pre-existing Canvas series and combine episodes together to form a contest entry, it would probably be better to start with earlier episodes and maybe just cut out parts that don't need to be there and just kind of combine the more interesting elements and act as like a summarized version of it if you're going to present the episodes without changes. It's too hard to understand what is going on when we're coming halfway into the series with no background information. And so I think that there's obviously a lot of thought behind this. It seems like there is an intricate and detailed plot going on here, and it does seem to be playing off of a lot of historical concepts. It's playing with interesting lore and interesting ideas and different aspects of ancient Egypt, and there's something here. There's an interesting narrative here. It's too difficult to understand when we're starting at episode 33. It also doesn't help that, again, the Canvas episodes are shorter, and so they've just been kind of stitched together, and so we have smaller episodes that have been combined to form larger ones, and so it feels like some of the scenes aren't connected because they aren't, and so we've just kind of put a bunch of episodes together, but they don't flow that well into each other. And so we're constantly jumping around between different plot threads and different characters, and it's just very confusing. There is also the concern that this is in the fantasy category foremost, which means it's under the most epic category of the contest, which means it's up against action series, fantasy series, isekai series, things that have a higher pace and higher stakes. And so this is almost a supernatural medical drama about medical students trying to find solutions to an ancient plague that's returned and the strange magical, the supernatural elements of it, but it doesn't quite meet the type of tone that you would expect from a most epic contest entry. And so since it's focused on a plague and the more intimate drama between characters who are being possessed of this ancient blood rage, and also in some cases are being possessed of ancient deities, and how that's all working in tandem to try and solve this thing, and there are political conspiracies going on, and there's intrigue there. I think it would probably fit better in the most gripping category, just for the type of tone that it seems to go for, whereas epic is going to be much more like broader action and like faster paced type of narratives. And so this, as categorized in the fantasy genre, it's not really in the right spot, I don't think, tonally, and so it's probably going to struggle in that category because it's so different from what I think the expectation is. But I do think there's an interesting story here, and if anything that I've described about the Egyptian lore and the plague and the medical drama and whatnot sounds interesting, then definitely consider checking out the Canvas version. But I don't think that this contest entry really does the series justice. I think that it would have been better to probably either remake some of the earlier episodes for the series or re-edit them, like cut them differently to kind of serve as a good introduction into this world. But this is not a good way to get introduced to this story because it just is too confusing to start at episode 33 without that background context. So alright, next we're going to be taking a look at My Main Character Syndrome by Ray Tian. This is a romance drama. I'll read the description and then we'll take a look at it. Attractive and affluent, Danica has everything, except she can only interact with people through online platforms and never in person. One day, a stranger, Linus, falls from the sky, revealing that a parallel world exists. As Linus seeks to return to his own world, Danica seeks to escape with him. Yeah, so that more or less summarizes it, except for this last part, which hasn't happened yet in the episodes, and I think getting to this part sooner, this Danica wanting to escape with Linus, building to that sooner would have probably made this a little bit more compelling. It would have helped build that hook, and get readers really attached to it. But this is a fun little romance with a silly concept. So we have our main character, who is a popular girl on the internet, and that's her job. So she streams and makes posts and takes pictures and things like that and documents her life, and she's paid to do this, and so she lives a very affluent life. But as we slowly find out, she lives in a city entirely by herself, and so the only other people in the city with her are robots. They're automatons and holograms, and so the only way she's able to interact with real people, or at least what she assumes are real people, is over the internet. And so despite being incredibly famous and successful, she's entirely alone in terms of actual human contact. Until one day when Linus mysteriously falls out of the sky and just kind of literally lands in her arms. And so we have quite literal star-crossed lovers in this case. And obviously, this being a romance story, she's kind of smitten with him, and we see how this hints at a probable relationship in the future. So it's a pretty simple setup, and I think that it does a lot of things pretty well. Something I like about it is that we have this strange world where this popular girl lives in a city only full of robots, and there's nobody else around. But the episodes themselves don't state this right away. We're kind of introduced to it naturally, and so what we see from Danica's perspective, it's portrayed as normal, but it isn't until Linus shows up that we really start to get explanations as to like what's going on, and we start to realize alongside Linus how abnormal this really is. And so I like that it does that. It kind of unfolds that slowly without just stating it all in plain terms. It gives you the time to slowly get rolled into it, and I think that that's very well done. So our setup here is pretty good. The only thing I think we're missing is, like I said, the bit about Linus trying to find a way back to his own world isn't really reached in the comic itself. So we haven't quite got to that point by the end of the 3rd episode, and I think we need that to happen because obviously this being a romance story with only 2 human characters, there's the implication that they're going to be slowly falling in love, and so we kind of know that that's going to be the direction that it takes. We know that we're going to be building up a relationship here, but we need to know what is the crux of this relationship. You know, what are the plot elements that are going to make this interesting? What are the challenges that they're going to have to overcome together that are going to drive them closer together? And that obviously is that element of trying to work together to find a way to get back to the regular world that Linus is from, where there are normal human people living and not just robots everywhere. But because we don't quite get to that point, we haven't quite set up what our general plot direction is. So we don't really know what that process is going to look like, how we're going to work toward getting back to our regular world. And so a little bit more in that direction would have helped us build investment in this. And I do think something else we could probably do more of is kind of demonstrate how Danica is so strangely socialized. So since she's only used to talking to people on the internet, she seems to adapt really quickly to having our main character around, and I think that's showing a little bit more difficulty of her to connect in a physical space would kind of help build up the strange situation that she's actually in, and kind of help us build investment in her as a character, because then we would have an additional journey to watch her go on, watch her learn to become normally socialized, watch her learn how to interact with people in a physical space when she has zero experience with doing that, and a little bit more setup in terms of how these characters get attached to each other could also be nice. So Danica has this guy, fall into her arms one night, and since she lives in an entire city alone, presumably there is plenty of places where he could live, but he ends up moving in to her penthouse suite, and so they're living in the same building together. But I think a little bit more elaboration on why she's so willing to immediately adapt to that, immediately adopt this guy and bring him into her life when she's not used to that kind of interaction. I think it would kind of help to set that up a little bit more and just kind of build more tension in their relationship and allow us to get more invested in seeing how their journey progresses, how they become enamored with each other. And so I think this is a really interesting idea. It presents very fun characters and it presents fun scenarios. I just think that a little bit more setup and kind of getting more quickly to the point could help build investment in the story. So I'm very curious to see where it goes. I did enjoy it quite a bit, and I'll look forward to more. Alright, so next we have My Dream by Kawakari98. It is also a romance drama. And the description reads, a tale of 4 friends navigating their struggles in life. Someone is on the verge of abandoning their dreams while another feels lost with no clear purpose. However, as they come together, a journey of self-discovery unfolds. So, this description actually does a better job explaining the story than the story itself does. And so this is something I always like to point out, is that whatever's in the description, we want to make sure that it's very, very clearly in the episodes as well, so that our expectations when we read the description are being met. So this is effectively what happens, but we don't really get elaboration on any of this information, and so it kind of feels like it's very vague and in the background. And essentially what this story is about is the son of a wealthy business family and the brother of the successor to that wealthy business family. And so we have one son who's taking over the family business. He's writing a book. He's very successful. Everybody loves him. And the other son who isn't really doing anything. And we kind of see how he feels disaffected. He kind of feels detached from his family. They aren't happy with him, and obviously them being unhappy with him and like not really approving of his lack of direction in life kind of weighs on him. He's not very happy either, but I think that what we're kind of missing with this character and his setup is what his goals actually are. So it's implied in the description that he's kind of directionless, but it would be nice to kind of know a little bit more about that. Why is he so conflicted? Why isn't he interested in the family business? And what interests does he have? What things does he like? Does he maybe have hobbies that the family just doesn't approve of? Or does he have nothing that he cares about? Like, we could get a little bit more elaboration on our main character. But anyways, as he's wandering one night while his brother's being announced as the future CEO of the company, he stumbles upon a crying woman who seemingly has just gone through a breakup. And he sits down to try and comfort her, and they have a brief conversation where she ends up joking about how they could go from strangers to potentially lovers, but obviously this is intended as a joke, and she says that it doesn't matter because they'll never see each other again, and they part ways. But because we've read webtoons before, we know that what we've probably done is just establish what the actual direction of the plot is going to be, and lo and behold, they do in fact see each other again in the future. So this is kind of our meet cute. This is our characters bumping into each other for the first time and kind of seeing how they interact, but it does feel a little bit like with a lack of background on our main guy here, it's a little bit harder to invest in this. We can't really tell what his objectives are, what his intentions are, and so he just kind of inserts himself into this woman's business in a way that is perhaps questionable, since we don't know if he's a good guy yet, and we never really find that out either. But anyways, then we kind of see how he interacts with his family and how they disapprove of him, and he goes out to hang out with one of his friends, and they end up going to a bakery that his friend recommends, and it turns out that the lady he met on the staircase works at the bakery, and that's where the comic ends. And so we have the very, very beginnings of a premise here. We have a simple concept of a kind of disaffected guy that's a little bit aimless in life, falling in love with a lady that works at a bakery, but on its own, it's just, I think that there's a little bit of setup missing here. So essentially what we have is two pretty characters that bump into each other and presumably will end up building a relationship together, but that's just the foundational level. Like, that is essentially only telling us that this is a romance story. And so all we know is here's character A, here's character B, and they're probably going to fall in love. So we know that it's a romance story, and we have a very, very basic amount of background on our main guy with his disapproving wealthy family. But we don't really know anything about our main girl yet, other than that she's seemingly been through a breakup recently. And we don't go very far to build their personalities much. And so it just feels like we haven't gotten all the way through the setup phase of the story. And so we've done a good job building this coincidental meeting where we have our characters that bumped into each other fatefully one night and expected to never cross paths again, but suddenly they are crossing paths again. And so we've done a good job with that. That is our inciting incident. That's how our characters kind of get involved with each other, but we also haven't quite finished the inciting incident. We don't really know like how this is going to play out long term, because the scenario ends before we establish any sort of commitment between them. And so for all we know, this guy comes to this bake shop, sees this lady that he just bumped into the other day, and if he never comes back here, the story ends there. But obviously, again, it being a romance, we're going to be setting up that he's probably going to come back. It's probably not going to end there, but we don't really have the connective tissue here. We don't really have the framework that makes these characters kind of want to get involved with each other. And so it feels like we haven't quite got all the way through the setup. I feel like these 3 episodes could be combined into one episode, and that would be a good start. But it's like we're missing 2 additional episodes, kind of building the connection that these two are going to have, building the circumstances that kind of push them together. So, maybe our wealthy guy gets disowned by his family. Now he needs a job, and he decides to work for this lady because he already knows her, and they have some kind of rapport going on. As we can see in the thumbnail of the series, he's wearing the same apron as her, and so it seems like he is going to get involved with this bakery in some way, but we don't know why yet, and so just kind of getting to that point a little bit faster would help us build an investment in these characters. It would help us kind of build an expectation for how this relationship is going to play out and why we should be interested in it. And so it feels like 1 episode turned into 3 episodes. I feel like we need to move a little bit more quickly just to building that framework, just kind of establishing what are the external forces that are helping to push these characters together. So there's a fun idea here, but with the information that we have so far, it's just not quite enough to really latch on to long term. I will look forward to seeing how it develops, though, because I think that, again, it shows a decent understanding of what's expected of the romance genre, and so it shows potential. I think that it does have the potential to go on to be a very entertaining story. It's just not quite done with the introductory phase, and so I look forward to seeing more of it and seeing where it might go and how it might develop. Anyways, that is our last series for the day, and that is number 50. That is the 50th one that I have now read and reviewed, and I still have more than 20 left to go. I think I said at the beginning, but I'm reading these linearly as they've been posted on the Reddit post, and so if I haven't got to yours yet, it will be coming up. I'm going to finish everything that's been submitted to this thread, and we may even do an additional thread after that, because I've been having fun going through these. It's been a lot of fun to see all of the incredible things that everybody has made and kind of just discuss different ways that people either capture or don't capture the essence of the contest, the way that people are able to sell their series or maybe fall short of selling their series or setting things up. And so I think this has been a lot of fun. And if you've enjoyed it as well, you might also consider checking out my contest entry, which is a horror thriller called Dumpster Girl. It's about a ghost and some garbage. Anyways, I think that's going to be just about everything that I've got here and now, and if you enjoyed the video, do consider liking it and subscribing to the channel and doing all of that YouTube stuff. It would be greatly appreciated, but I'm going to go ahead and end this one here, and I will see you in your nightmares.